Good evening. Tonight we're going to talk about our 21-22 school year PSAA assessment and Keystone exam results. So tonight you're going to see a district summary of the ELA, which is English Language Arts by grade, mathematics by grade, science by grade, and some additional reporting will be the cohort data. The Future Ready Index actually just became populated sometime today, so you'll be able to go to that public-facing site, and we're going to talk a little bit about the action plans that we have from our comprehensive plan. And just as a quick reminder, our assessments for English Language Arts are administered in grades 3 through 8. Math is also administered in grades 3 through 8. Science is administered in grades 4 and 8. And we'll also talk about our Keystone data, and I'll show you that in a couple slides ahead. So the PSAA assessments, I kind of mentioned this already, but again, looking at what grade levels and what subject areas are administered, and then the Keystone or exams are end-of-course assessments, really designed to assess proficiency in the subject areas of literature, Algebra 1, and biology. So the first section we're going to take a look at is the information from third grade, ELA, and math trends. So there are two sets of data you'll look at tonight. When they look at the third grade trends, that means grade level of third grade year over different years. So 2018, one group of students, 2019, one group of students, 2021, obviously we did not have the assessments in 2020, and then 2022. So these are different students over the different years. I won't do the full read aloud for you here, but just taking notice, thinking about the students that we have assessed here in 2022, these were students that missed a part of their first grade year, and then that second grade year was a mix of students with in-person instructions, obviously in the beginning of the year, all virtual instruction. So taking a look at where we were in that 2019, 2020 year, 21 year even, compared to that 2022, there are some discrepancies looking at some of this data based on overall trends. Same thing of fourth grade, and I know we talked about this once before. I do have these based on the bar graphs, and then in a slide or two, you'll be able to see the numbers, because I know just depending on how you like to look at data, it might be more helpful to look at the actual numbers. Taking a look at, though, at the fourth grade, this is the ELA math trends as well as their science on here. So taking a look here, you can see again, we have the 2018, 2019, 2021, and 2022 data. This looks a little more consistent overall, looking at what our fourth graders have done year over year. So this next slide, I'll give you a little more time to take a look at it. This information has the information for advanced and proficient scores in 2019, 2021, 2022, and then the comparison of the state average of advanced and proficient for 2022. The last column is the difference from the Springford scores to the state comparison. And just about maybe 2.5 hours ago, the site had been updated with some comparison data to look at different schools across the state, and I'll share that with you in just a little bit. I think it's really important to note where our students continue to outrank many of the state comparisons. We don't just put all of the information in this one bucket of PSAA results, but it is a nice comparison to understand where our students continue to achieve in the areas of math, ELA, and in this case, fourth grade with science. One of the things some of the community members asked last spring when I gave the 21 presentation was really that breakdown of not just looking at proficient and advanced, but really looking at where those 4 categories fall. So I did this on the slide looking at, again, the ELA for grades 3 and 4, math 3 and 4, and then grade science for fourth grade. And each of the categories below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. The state has set a measure that we expect all students to be proficient or advanced. That's the end goal. Obviously, any students that aren't hitting those benchmarks, we're looking at other additional data. How do we support those students to continue to make growth, whether towards their IEP goals, whether towards the other state standard benchmarks, but we're making sure that we're moving all students towards proficiency.
Ms. Gardy?
Yes.
I don't know if it's okay to ask questions now, or do you want
Sure.
me to hold them
You
to
can
the
go
end?
ahead if it helps.
Going back to that slide, I don't recall that slide. Maybe you did have it in the spring presentation when we looked at the 21 data. This is a new slide?
That is a new slide. You are correct.
Okay. So if that's the case, do you have any, I mean, so do we know like how we're trending from the last presentation with regards to this data?
I'm sorry, I can certainly share you with that. I'll have to
Okay.
add it and pull it. I have it in my files.
Okay.
I just don't have it on the slide. I just know that people had asked specifically where that breakdown was
Got
for
it.
basic. So if we go back a slide, it's sort of here. When you look at that 21, you can see where we were. I don't have the breakdown on that slide with the basic and below basic, but in 2021, for example, for third grade ELA, the total proficient and advanced was 78%. For 2022, it was 69.7, and you can see it if you look in those two columns there for 21 and 22, you can see the overall for advanced and proficient. I don't have the breakdowns in these
No
slides
worries.
for that, but we certainly obviously have that.
Follow up, thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Moving on to then the next section is fifth grade. So taking a look, this information is the fifth grade trend data for 2018, 2019, 2021, and 2022. I take a little bit of note here when we're looking at on the left is the ELA and the right is the math with the darker blue. It's pretty consistent with over the last couple of years with ELA. One of the things I did notice looking at this data is a little bit of an upswing from 21 to 22 with the math scores. And the information that I saw earlier today that had been posted on the PDE website indicates all of the schools in Pennsylvania based on grade level, based on subject area. And just taking a look at for our data, I actually have it just one more page over, but for ELA for fifth grade, we were in the top 12% of the state. And then for the county, we were in the top third. For the math scores for grade 5, we were in the top 13% for the state, and again, the top third in the county. So although some of our scores may not look at the proficiency levels we would hope for, in that comparison, we are doing pretty well as far as the achievement of our students in comparison to other schools across the state and within our county. This same slide here is for grade 6 ELA and math trends. So taking a look, it's very similar looking to the fifth grade data overall as far as the bounce back a little bit for the math. And you can see it appears that the 2022 data for the ELA also kind of jumped back up to where it was in 2018 and 2019. Just go ahead while you take a look here. This is similar to the previous slide when I broke it down for ELA for 5th and 6th grade ELA and then 5th and 6th grade math. You can see the overall proficiency and advance for both 2019, 2021, and 2022 by comparison to the state in 2022. For the ELA scores for the state, for 6th grade we were in the top 4%. In the county we're in the top 13%. Grade 6 for math was in the top 5.5%, and for the county, we're again in the top 15th% of the county. This next slide represents that breakdown between below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced, again for ELA and math, both 5th and 6th grade. So I'll give you a second to take a look at that. This next section is the grade 7 ELA and math trends. Again, we're taking a look at the same types of slides, ELA being on the left, math being on the right. One of the data points that I recognize is that our math scores in 7th grade still need some rebounding, and there could be a lot of reasons for that. Some of the things that we're doing, though, we have a new support person in place in the 7th grade math support. We are also using our NWEA and ExactPath to bring in and to kind of look at that information for students to help our students continue to grow. Very specifically, though, taking a look at our 7th grade results, you can see again where we ranked percentage compared to the state. And for grade 7 ELA for the state, we were in the top 4%. In the county, the top 13%. And then for math, even though we have some room to grow for our math scores, we were still in the top 5% in the state and the top 25% in the county. This next slide represents the grade 8 ELA math and science trends. Again, looking over the course of several years now, looking at our data, we want to make sure that we're really focusing in on supporting our students in those math scores for PSSA. One of the things that I want to note is all of our students that are enrolled in grade 8 take our 8th grade PSSA. Every student in 8th grade does that. Some of our students also are enrolled in the Algebra 1 class, so they're taking the Keystone. They're not necessarily taking an 8th grade math course. So that's one of the things that we've looked at over time, just looking at our student performance in each of the coursework. But just taking a look at this data, it does appear that there was a bit of a rebound based on the 21 to 22 data, but hasn't quite gotten back to that level before those COVID years. This next slide breaks down again, looking at proficiency from 19, 21, and 22 with the comparison to the average of advanced and proficient in the state for 2022. Again, looking at where we were in the state, the top 5% in ELA, the top 25% in the county for ELA. Math was in the top 9% of the state, and in the county, we're in the top half of the county. For the science scores in the state were the top 3%, and the county was in the top 10%. And again, I don't have these on the slides because quite literally, I think it was about 5:30 when I checked again, and it was there. I can certainly share that information again. Before I move on to the next whole piece, these are the 7th and 8th grade results. Again, just taking a look at that basic and below basic, proficient and advanced by grade level and subject area. Before I move on to the Keystone information, any questions about the PSSA data? Sometimes it's easier to take a question now, and if not, I can take questions at the end.
Thank you for all of this, by the way. If I don't say that at the end,
No problem.
because I know how time-consuming it is to gather all this data and to spend that time to you and your team. And this is, I did want to, tell you what you already know, is that this is absolutely the learning loss that we've been talking about as a nation, not just as a district. This demonstrates there in our state, across the board, the learning loss that has occurred. I think, and we are not immune to it, and I think we've put in a lot of effort to prevent some of that learning loss to occur, but also now I know that you guys are diving into pockets of this information and looking at ways to bring this up. Why, get the students that are on the cusp of basic to proficient and what we can do. And I know because we're part of the conversations at the curriculum committee meetings, but I know also behind the scenes you guys are, though we've done well, you're not satisfied, and we'll continue to work at it. I do hope either, if not now, at the end of your presentation, that you are able to share, other than the fact that we have a new 7th grade math support person in place and that you're looking at the data with the NWEA, with that, what are the things that we have done or we are doing as a district to continue to grow, because we want to do better, I know. So.
Thank you. Yes, at the end of the slides, I have a couple of things, and I know that Dr. Murray will present again at committee in January a little bit more about the learning loss plan and the remaining expenditures that we have from the ESSER funding. But absolutely, thank you, Dr. Wright.
And Ms. Gardy, I think what I'm trying to reconcile in my mind right now is when I look at these numbers, and I'm actually looking at the presentation that was done in March for the previous, time frame. But you look at the spring forward to state comparison, and the numbers. I mean, in some cases, and when we're talking as big as like a 10% increase in how our students are performing relative to the state. And again, we expect our school district to perform better relative to the state, but I don't want to minimize the fact that we are making significant gains from that standpoint. But then I look at something like on the previous slide where 8th grade math, we have 50%, right? So here, going back to just to reinforce what Dr. Wright was mentioning, I'd love to hear that at the end.
The next section is the Keystone exam data. And we're going to talk about the literature, Algebra 1 and biology. So just for clarity's sake here, these scores represent all the test takers that took the spring administration. Sometimes there are numbers that are banked in the future ready. Sometimes students retake them in the winter. So this is just representative of all the scores from the either 2019 spring administration, 2021, or 2022, because sometimes, looking at different data sources means different things. So I just wanted to be clear on where these numbers came from. But taking a look at what our students did in the spring administration, most of our students in that spring administration take the literature exam in 9th grade. Algebra 1 is, again, all of these are end of course exams. So whatever year the student was enrolled in Algebra 1 is the year that they would take that exam. And then in biology, most of our students take biology in 10th grade. So just that's a representative data sample from the data. So taking a look, again, looking at the information based on the literature scores was 78.6, Algebra 1 was 63.9, the biology is 79.7, and then that comparison to the state average, and then that difference over that. So just as Dr. Wright and Mrs. Hermans had indicated, there are areas that we want to make sure that we're continuing to focus on, looking at how our students are doing, making sure that we're planning for some tutoring or support that we have for our students in place should they not have hit that proficiency during that first testing administration that they took in the spring. This is the breakdown, again, just like those previous slides, just taking a look at where those students fell below basic, proficient, or advanced. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about how to make sure our students hit those proficiency benchmarks. Should they, when they take that assessment, they can take it again. Like I mentioned, that second administration, sometimes even a third. We do have tutoring in place for many of our Keystone courses, and teachers are working through that. You'll see that sometimes there are people on the agenda for approval for tutoring. That's what that's representative of, to continue to provide support to our students. So the next section is cohort data. So the other data that I had just shared was the trend data based on that grade level. This cohort is actually the same students each year that have taken assessment. So the first set of students that I have listed here are our current 9th graders. They're the class of 2026. So taking a look at this is how they have fared over the last years from 2017 to 2022. So taking a look at this, you can see where they were back in 3rd grade. I put the little star in between their 5th and 7th grade years, looking at where that would be the 2020 year where they did not take the assessment. So you can see, again, that trend that we have seen is the drop down in math. One of the things that we do have to look at with scores is the expectation of student proficiency does increase getting into 8th grade compared to the 3rd grade. So that line, if you will, if you were comparing it to a sports analogy, you would have to be faster in 8th grade than you were in 3rd grade. But just thinking about that, we're still looking at a lower proficiency level in the math than we would want. What I wanted to share here was taking a look at the comparison. So just to be clear on what I'm doing here is this information is our information, both ELA and math. On this next slide, I have ELA compared to the state compared to our scores of ELA. So the state is the green, our scores are the blue. So kind of just looking at that same trend back and forth. So let me just go back one again. If you take a look at where we were for our ELA scores, and then we're looking ahead here, just kind of where that trend line looks. So we're looking at, there's definitely a dip in the state data in that 2019 year, kind of a little bit better in the 2021 year, a little bit better in the 2022. And our data sort of represents that same trend line when we look at that comparison to the state. And that is the comparison to ELA. And then over here, this is the math comparison. So again, taking a look, if we look at that trend line, you can see our data definitely dips from 3rd grade to 8th grade, but so does the state. So again, it's a comparison, it's a data point and understanding of where the trends are. It doesn't necessarily give us all the answers, but it definitely gives us a point of reference, knowing that students overall outperform themselves in 3rd grade as compared to by the time they get to 8th grade. So that's the information that we really need to look at, individual student by student, understanding how they're performing in their classes. And this next section is the class of 2027. So again, they have the data from 2018, 2019, 21, and 22. They're our current 8th graders. So you can kind of see where they've trended over time. This next class is the class of 2028, so there are current 7th graders, and you can see their data from 2019, 2021, and 2022. So you can see by the time they took their 6th grade PSSAs, their scores did rebound more towards what they were back when they were in 3rd grade as compared to when they were in 5th grade for math especially. And the last, this is actually not pre-pandemic data because this is our current 6th grade group. Their first testing year was in that 2021 school year as a 4th grade group, and then as a 5th grade group, you can see where they fell both years there. The last section I wanted to just talk about, this is the Future Ready PA Index. This is a public-facing site. As I mentioned earlier, this morning I did not see it all published, and as of this evening it was. So this really, what this does is it gives state measures about proficiency for proficient or advanced, both on PSSA, Keystone, for ELA, math and science. They're really looking at demonstrating growth for that ELA math and science content, as well as making sure that we're working through getting more advanced students in those subject areas. The other section of the site also talks about on-track measures, specifically for English language arts growth, English language growth and attainment, looking at regular attendance. They want to look at early indicators of success for grade 3, and that's for reading, and then early indicators of success for grade 7 for mathematics. There's also a section labeled college and career measures. They really look at career standards of benchmarking. There's a 4-year cohort for graduation, a 5-year cohort for graduation, some information about industry-based learning, industry-based competencies, whether or not there's a rigorous course of study, and post-secondary transition. So that information is out on the site, and I have a slide here that when we post this, everyone will be able to have access to those links to get to that information. Just kind of going back as a reminder, when we're thinking about what we talk about as spring forward learning, really it's the focus of student learning with curriculum assessment, instruction, and management. Really thinking about the mindset of the whole child, the whole student, looking at their social emotional learning, their collaboration and connection with family, with other students, with their teachers. These are the pillars that we build everything upon to focus and build for our students. So really thinking about where we were and what we're talking about, our points of pride really are the comprehensive planning team had identified action steps, which we are in the midst of working towards. We have that learning loss plan that addresses tutoring. We have summer programs, social, emotional, and mental health resources are being provided to our students. Our students really were high achieving by comparison to other schools across the state. We recognize that COVID did have an impact on the data. With the learning loss supports that are in place, we're starting to see some of that rebounding based on those scores. And additionally, I know that's really small to read, and I know we were checking it earlier if I could read it from here, but really focusing in on the comprehensive plan. These are our priority areas. We had talked about these. Dr. Murray had presented on these before, and when I talked last, I guess it was June, we talked through a little bit of the things that we're doing, so I'm not going to reiterate every piece that I had shared before, but really looking at, for mathematics is one of our anchor areas, really looking at all buildings will meet or exceed that 2030 PSSA proficiency target for math, and they're making some adjustments to those targets as we speak. The goal too is also to ensure all curriculum documents are standards aligned and eligible content is taught prior to the PSSA. So as Dr. Bright was asking, what are we doing internally to make sure that we're supporting our students, making sure that really the curriculum and the materials that we're providing our students align to exactly what we should be doing by end of year. And then the third goal here is using that benchmark data to establish a system of intervention for students in math. We're beginning that process. We're in year 1 of that comprehensive plan, really doing some data analysis, working with their building principals as they're working on their building plans. The second goal is systems of intervention, so really establishing a district system, really fully ensuring that all students get the implementation of supports that they need. We're talking about multi-tiered systems of support. and making sure that we also looking at disaggregated data to identify and close achievement gaps for students in different pockets. And we're not just talking about students that have been lower achieving, we're also making sure that our highest achieving students are also continuing to grow, which is really important as well. And the last priority that we have from our comprehensive plan is making sure that we're focusing on inclusive practices with special education, really increasing the percentage of special education students receiving support and services in the regular and general education settings, really thinking about that least restrictive environment, making sure that we're really focusing in on supporting students in our general education programs. As I mentioned, I have linked here, which obviously you're not linking from here, but when we post this, you'll have the links to where to get that PSSA the Keystone exam data and PSSA information. That'll link right to that site where you'll be able to see all the information. There's a Future Ready PA glossary, also the Future Ready Index, and there's family and teacher resources. And the last piece I had really was just, did you have any questions? And I want to address, I guess, what Dr. Wright and Mrs. Hermans were asking. More specifically, one of the things that we're doing is working with our teachers. We have monthly meetings with our 5-6 math and ELA teachers, so our curriculum supervisors are leading those with our instructional coaches. We also have what we call PLCs, professional learning communities, in grades K to 4, really focusing in on building principles, essentially establish the schedule, and then our curriculum supervisors and instructional coaches go along and support the building, looking at data, looking at instructional practices, looking at resources, so that they can really work and build those lessons alongside teachers to make sure that they're supporting them. Across the district, our building principals have been leading data team meetings and really digging in and looking at where the students are, but also looking at teacher-specific data, making sure that teachers are growing their students as they expect them to. So those are all things that we've been doing throughout last spring and then into this fall, making sure that we're supporting our students. So I'll stop here. If you have any specific questions, I can certainly answer.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone on the board who had a question? And Mrs. Motzer, Dr. Motzer.
First of all, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation because it was very clear and easy to understand. And I just wanted to comment that PSSAs are one measure and only one measure. It's a snapshot. It's a snapshot from last spring. So although it's easy for us to look at this beautiful data on all of these graphs and reflect on our district as a whole, I want all of us to realize that there are so many other measures that teachers are collecting on a daily basis that they're using daily to inform instruction. So although PSSAs, like I said, are easy for us to look at and compare our performance across the state, it's just one small measure, and I want to keep that in perspective. So thank you. Thank you to everything that you and all the teachers are doing daily to support students and not just on PSSA days.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Zalewski?
So thank you. That was very detailed. I do have a couple questions, though. So I know one of the things we had asked in the past was you had given us comparisons with the state data, and I do hear you adding in the county data, which just became available. That was for the PSSAs mostly, correct? Do you have anything for Keystone at all with how we do in comparison to our neighboring districts and how that's happening?
I do have that, and that actually became available this afternoon. The tricky part of that compared to the slide that I had prepared was that is the information that gets banked. So if I was a 9th grader and I took the lit exam and I didn't pass, I could take it again in 10th grade, and that gets held to 11th grade. That one link will actually take you to that, and it's every school district. I can certainly share that with you. I didn't want to convolute what I had here tonight because it wouldn't be comparing apples to apples here. So I didn't put that there. Like all the PSSA data is that particular group of students in that particular moment. The Keystone data is not. That's what happened last year. There was some confusion about some scores were banked and some were the actual that happened in the spring of 2021. So I didn't have that up there for that reason, but that one file that the state posted today is there, but it'll say all students and they all say 11th grade, and we know that students all don't take them in 11th grade. They could take it all the way back in 6th grade if they were taking Algebra 1 in 6th grade. So that would be misleading based on the information I shared tonight, but that's certainly available for anyone to look at.
Okay, that's good. I also noticed that, throughout the whole presentation, pretty much, and we know this, right, that the math is an issue. And there have been a lot of efforts to address that and remediate that. But then when they take the algebra Keystone, did we see that? Was I the only one that saw that number spike? Did you guys see that number spiked? So something's happening, right? Because there might be some, I don't want to say regression, but there might be a slowdown maybe in the acquisition of some of the math skills, but at some point something is connecting, because they wouldn't have that high rate of success on the Keystone if they weren't getting it. Can you comment on that at all?
I can't tell you specifically about the test construction. What I can tell you is when we look at our NWEA data, and that's nationally normed, when you look at a third grade, that's what I gave the analogy about running. If I run and I'm expected to get faster over time, I think what they did when they gave the cut scores for 8th grade, or even starting in 5th grade, but the cut scores, it's basically the students have to be better at math over time from 3rd grade. So if you were an average student in 3rd grade, by the time you get to 8th grade, you look like you're a below average student because of the cut score. Now, with that said, these are the 8th grade standards, the expectations of what 8th graders need to do. So what we're doing very specifically is looking at, do our curriculum maps align exactly where the anchor standards tell us they need to be, and what skills do they need to develop? So getting to the algebra piece, that is a little bit, yes, they need all those background skills, but it might be very specific, let's just say rounding decimals as compared to solving an equation. So those are different skills that students may or may not have. We do have that very specific information based on the standards and based on those anchors. So that's Dr. Reinheimer, who is our curriculum supervisor for secondary mathematics, has been focused in on that, working with all the way 5 to 8, really looking at that data. One of the things we're trying to strengthen is making sure our scope and sequence works from 5th to 6th to 7th to 8th grade, really making sure that we're building upon what students are experiencing K to 4 all the way up through 8th.
And then this might be more a question for Dr. Murray too. So we had talked about reviewing all of the resources that we're using, and I'm sure you're doing that in curriculum and talking about in curriculum and technology. And then we were using a lot of ESSER funds, and even tonight there are things on the agenda to be approved using more of the ESSER funds. One of the concerns I think that many of us had before was that we were using that money to have these initiatives and address this learning loss and do these different things. When that's done, are we going to be able to carry on, especially with the remediation in math and continuing with that deep dive into what's happening? Has there been discussion about how we're going to address that?
So I can answer one part, and then Dr. Murray can talk about the ESSER funds. I think some of the things that we're doing with our staff really has no additional cost, other than obviously we're here employed, working year over year with teachers, and teachers are working with students. I'm not looking at that point for any additional resources. One of the things that Dr. Reinheimer has done with 5-6 as a book study. So they're working very specifically on a book study. So Mrs. Nunneviller purchased that book for the teachers to work through that. So there's a small cost there. But those types of things that we're working on in curriculum review and writing does not cost additional funds. Now, part of what you asked, I think, is where do we fall in the curriculum cycle, and that will the next academic year, will be in a review for grades 5 through 8 for math. And then I believe it's the following year, don't quote me on that, I don't have it in front of me, but the following year would be the K to 4 review. So those types of things are kind of set in our budget cycle, but we don't necessarily need new resources to make revisions to the curriculum. There are plenty of available resources, either free or realigning the ones that we have in order to better serve our students. As far as the ESSER funding, though, tutoring and things like that, Dr. Murray would have to respond to that.
Sure, I can speak to that. So that is one of the challenges with the ESSER funds, is that we know it's going to drop off, and we've been very careful with how we're allocating that fund, those funds, so that we're very aware of that. One of the activities, for example, is Exact Path. That's something that we are using the ESSER funding to pay for, but Mrs. Gardy did work in a continuation plan to be able to build that into the curriculum budget, so something like Exact Path won't fall off when that money goes away. Programs such as Summer Rams, though, is something we are going to have a conversation about. because all of our summer RAMs has been 100% funded through the ESSER funding. It is an expensive program. We do feel it's been effective. Our families have gotten a lot from it. And we, as you mentioned, it is on tonight as well for another year. But that's something that we as a district will have to decide if we want to continue it. We would need a plan to be able to do that. Some of the other pieces like tutoring is also another aspect that we would have to have a discussion about whether or not we would want to continue that. I think the hope, though, is that we're using this money for purposeful interventions now so that it is not a long-term need. The other piece I wanted to mention with the comprehensive plan is our second goal is focusing on a system of intervention. And the goal of that is to build systems within our regular functioning day that really support students when they're struggling. And that's good practice with or without ESSER funding. So that is something that we look forward to having regardless of the ESSER funding, and would be more so based on the comprehensive plan.
Okay, thank you. Both.
Yes, well, this question may be too granular, so if it is, feel free to, I can retract the question. But, focusing on that 8th grade math score, I know that, for example, in 7th grade, our curriculum department, based on various data points, is making a recommendation to families as to whether students should, get additional support in math and or reading. And it's my understanding that they're able to basically turn that down in 7th grade for other curriculum, other options. Whereas maybe like in 8th grade, I don't think that's actually the case. I think like, hey, if we're identifying you as someone who could really benefit from additional individualized instruction in math or reading, that we're going to help you get there in 8th grade before you get to the high school and things start really becoming finalized and documented. So I guess my question is, if that is in fact accurate and the case, do we find that families are taking up the recommendations of the district at 7th grade when the table stakes are low, in terms of like getting students the additional support then before it becomes too late? Like what are we seeing, if at all, with regards to that?
I'd have to look a little bit more specifically at that piece. I do know that there's a lot of times that conundrum about when you take algebra. When does algebra come in? And I think that we saw maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was a big push to get algebra done really early. And that's across the state, not just here. But there was a push to get algebra done early, and that has now since shifted a little bit, so there's not as much of a push there. I can look a little bit deeper into whether or not, I can't speak to whether or not those recommendations are being followed or not, but I do think, to your point earlier, that it is interesting when you look at the 8th grade data, and you look at those proficiency scores, they're shocking sometimes, but then when you look at the algebra, it just forces us to dig a little bit deeper into, like Mrs. Gardy said, those cut scores and the impact of that. But to Mrs. Mozer's point as well, we have a lot of other data points that we triangulate this with. So this is one snapshot. So we're looking at what's called PVOS data, which shows us how students are growing over time. And is that telling us the same story? And that's part of those the building data teams that are kind of peeling back and having the conversations about individual students. So I'll look more into the actual recommendation piece if we're seeing that. So I couldn't speak to that part, but.
Thank you.
And I do know we've had the discussion too, that we are looking at our curriculum specifically and at aligning it there, and to just, to talk a little bit more about that with the Keystones. When we have our students that are qualifying for algebra, taking that group that are qualifying in 7th grade and 8th grade and directing them toward algebra skills, we're not necessarily giving them the reinforcement of the skills that would show up on the PSAA. So that's where I know you've been having the discussion about how we align our curriculum so that the students that are going into the algebra also still get the reinforcement of the skills that be tested on in the PSAA. So and it's not just spring forward, it's across the board. So thank you. Anyone else on the board?
I just have one follow-up question. It kind of made me think, so with the summer RAMS program, the tutoring, those are things that have been funded by ESSER. Could you, with the budget coming, I know we have a budget presentation tonight and the budget will be coming, can you get the board, and maybe through Mr. Rizzo, a list of those items that ESSER specifically has covered in curriculum and then share that with us so
Sure.
that we could see that?
I actually presented that at the curriculum committee, so I can easily get that. for
Okay,
you.
yeah, if that, okay.
And that highlights the pieces that you'd like to keep.
Yes.
Right.
And my plan, last curriculum meeting, we presented kind of a status of the learning loss plan and where we were and what we were using. And our hope is we have a balance still of money that we have to spend that's allocated for learning loss. I wanted to do kind of an audit and spend down to see where we are first. And our goal is in January to come back with a proposal of how we're going to use the rest of that money.
I'm sure I was going to hear that tonight then from Dr. Wright, so thank you. Jumping the gun a little bit.
That's okay. All right. If there's no other board comment, then thank you very much, Mrs. Gardy.